The revolver kicks in his hand, and another man drops dead in the dirt. It's 1877 in Fort Griffin, Texas, a raw frontier town where the law is whatever you can enforce with bullets. This killer has just gunned down a man in the street, and nobody's rushing to arrest him. They know better. His name is John Wesley Hardin, and by the time he's caught, he'll have killed more men in face-to-face gunfights than any outlaw in American history. We're talking about someone who shot his first victim at 15 and never looked back. But here's what makes his story different from every Hollywood gunfighter you've seen. Hardin wasn't some mysterious drifter who rolled into town for a showdown at high noon. He was a preacher's son who grew up reading the Bible, a man who genuinely believed every person he killed deserved it. His violence wasn't random. It followed a twisted code that made perfect sense to him, even as his body count climbed past 40. The making of a killer. John Wesley Hardin enters the world in 1853, named after the founder of Methodism by his preacher father. The family moves through Texas, where young Wes learns to read scripture and handle firearms with equal skill. His father teaches him that a man defends his honor, his family, and his beliefs, no matter the cost. At 11, he stabs a classmate during a fight. The boy survives, but something shifts in Hardin. He's discovered he can hurt people, and more importantly, that he's willing to. 4 years later, everything changes. A former slave named Mage challenges him to a wrestling match. Hardin loses. The humiliation burns, but what happens next defines the rest of his life. The next day, he finds Mage on a road and shoots him multiple times, leaving him to die in the dust. He's 15 years old, and he's just committed murder. His father helps him flee, but instead of shame, Hardin feels justified. Mage had insulted him. In his mind, the killing was necessary, even righteous. This logic, this absolute certainty that violence is the answer, becomes the engine of his career. The Texas war zone Hardin runs straight into the chaos of Reconstruction, Texas. The Civil War has ended, but the violence hasn't stopped. It's just changed uniforms. Union soldiers occupy the state, and many Texans, especially Confederate sympathizers like Hardin's family, see them as invaders. 3 Union soldiers try to arrest him for the Mage killing. Hardin guns down all 3 in separate encounters within weeks. He's not yet 16, and he's killed 4 men. What should be a manhunt becomes something stranger. Local Texans start protecting him. To them, he's not a murderer but a rebel, someone standing up to Northern occupation. He becomes a folk hero in certain circles, which only feeds his ego. He joins a cattle drive heading north to Kansas, working as a cowboy. But trouble follows him like a shadow. In one town, he gets into an argument in a hotel room. The man in the next room pounds on the wall, shouting for quiet. Hardin shoots him through the wall. The man dies, and Hardin doesn't even know his name. The code of blood. By his early 20s, Hardin has developed a personal philosophy about killing. He writes about it later, explaining each shooting with careful detail, as if keeping a ledger of justified accounts. Someone cheats at cards? Shooting. Someone insults him? Shooting. Someone looks at him wrong? Well, you can guess. But here's the twisted part. Hardin genuinely believes he's the victim in these scenarios. In his mind, every man he kills has forced his hand through disrespect or aggression. He sees himself as a defender, not an aggressor. This delusion is made possible by the world around him. In many Texas communities, he's celebrated. He dresses well, gambles in saloons, and walks the streets openly. Local lawmen often refuse to arrest him, either because they sympathize with his politics or because they're terrified of his speed with a revolver. His reputation grows with each killing. Stories spread about his lightning-fast draw, his accuracy, his absolute willingness to kill without hesitation. Some tales are true, Others exaggerated, but the legend becomes its own kind of protection. The problem with building a reputation on violence is simple. Someone always wants to test it. More gunfighters start seeking him out, treating him like a target to prove themselves against. Each confrontation adds another body to his count, and each body makes the next confrontation more likely. He's trapped in a cycle of his own creation, and then he makes the mistake that will finally end his run. He kills a deputy sheriff in Comanche, Texas, during a card game. This time, he's crossed a line even his sympathizers can't ignore. The Texas Rangers, the most feared lawmen in the state, take up the hunt. The Rangers don't negotiate. They don't give warnings. They simply hunt. John Barclay Armstrong leads the pursuit. A lawman built from the same brutal Texas soil as Hardin, he's patient, methodical, and utterly relentless. He knows Hardin's family connections, his hideouts, his patterns. Armstrong doesn't rush. He just slowly tightens the noose. Hardin runs. For the first time in his life, he's not the hunter. He flees to Florida, adopts the name John Swain, tries to blend into a new life. He even gets married, starts a family. For 3 years, he almost pulls it off. But on August 23, 1877, Armstrong boards a train in Florida. He's tracked Hardin through a network of informants and sheer detective work. When he finds Hardin in a passenger car, he doesn't draw his gun immediately. He walks up calmly, grabs Hardin's arm, and says his real name. Hardin reaches for his revolver. It catches in his suspenders. That half-second fumble, after years of perfect draws, costs him everything. Armstrong slams a gun barrel against his head, and John Wesley Hardin collapses, unconscious, his legendary speed finally failing him. The trial is swift. Texas wants him gone, one way or another. He's convicted of murder and sentenced to 25 years in Huntsville prison. The most dangerous gunfighter in Texas history is locked in a cell, life behind bars, attacks guards, gets thrown in solitary attacks guards, gets thrown in solitary confinement repeatedly, and earns a reputation as the most violent inmate in Huntsville. But solitary confinement gives him something he's never had before: time to think. He starts reading law books, philosophy, theology. He becomes obsessed with the idea that he was right all along, that his killings were justified, and that he can prove it through legal theory. He teaches himself law with the same intensity he once applied to gunfighting. He also finds religion, or at least claims to. He writes long letters about redemption and God's forgiveness. Whether this transformation is genuine or calculated for parole hearings remains unclear. Probably both. The other inmates fear him, which gives him power even without a gun. He runs gambling operations, settles disputes, and operates as a kind of prison kingpin. Violence remains his currency, just in a different economy. His wife Jane visits regularly at first, bringing their children. But prison visits across state lines are expensive and exhausting. The letters become less frequent. She dies in 1892, and Hardin doesn't learn about it for weeks. Whatever humanity remained in him seems to die with her. After 15 years, Texas Governor Jim Hogg grants him a pardon. Not because Hardin deserves it, but because his family has political connections and his behavior in prison has marginally improved. On March 1, 1894, John Wesley Hardin walks out of Huntsville a free man. He's 40 years old and has spent nearly half his life in a cell. He immediately takes the Texas bar exam. Somehow, this man who killed his first person at 15 is now a licensed attorney. He opens a law practice in El Paso, and for a brief moment, it seems like he might actually become something other than a killer. But El Paso in the 1890s is a powder keg. It's a border town full of gamblers, outlaws, and drifters. Hardin fits right back in, not as a reformed citizen, But as the same violent man with a new business card, he starts drinking heavily. He gambles away what little money his law practice earns. He gets into arguments in saloons, and the old instincts resurface. He threatens people, waves his gun around, and brags about his past killings to anyone who'll listen. He meets a young woman named Callie Lewis and becomes obsessed with her. When she shows interest in another man, Martin McRose, Hardin loses his mind. He threatens McRose publicly, challenges him to a gunfight, and makes it clear he'll kill anyone who gets between him and Callie. McRose hires a local lawman named John Selman for protection. Selman is old school, a former outlaw himself, and he doesn't appreciate Hardin's threats. The two men circle each other for weeks, trading insults and warnings. On August 19, 1895, Hardin walks into the Acme Saloon in El Paso. He's drunk, rolling dice at the bar, his back to the door. John Selman walks in behind him, draws his revolver, and shoots Hardin in the back of the head. John Wesley Hardin dies instantly, face down on a barroom floor, killed the same way he killed dozens of others. No dramatic showdown, no final words. Just a bullet from behind, ending the life of a man who spent 42 years proving violence was the only language he understood. The newspapers call it justice. The citizens of El Paso call it overdue. John Selman claims self-defense, says Hardin was reaching for his gun. Nobody believes him, but nobody cares either. A grand jury indicts Selman for murder, but he's killed in a separate gunfight before the trial. The whole thing becomes footnotes in a story everyone wants to forget. Hardin's body is displayed in a local undertaker's window, like a carnival attraction. People line up to see the famous killer laid out in a cheap coffin. They take photographs. They steal pieces of his clothing as souvenirs. Even in death, he's a commodity. His funeral draws a surprisingly large crowd, though whether they're mourning or celebrating remains unclear. He's buried in El Paso's Concordia Cemetery, and for decades afterward, vandals steal pieces of his headstone. The mythology starts immediately. Dime novels turn him into a romantic outlaw, a misunderstood gunslinger forced into violence by circumstance. They ignore the racism, the cruelty, the pleasure he took in killing. They transform a murderer into a legend, because legends sell better than truth. His autobiography, published shortly before his death, becomes a bestseller. In it, he justifies every killing, portrays himself as a victim of persecution, and lies about half the details. Historians spend the next century trying to separate fact from fiction, and mostly failing. Texas goes through its own transformation. The open range disappears behind barbed wire. Railroads connect every town. Law enforcement becomes professionalized, with trained officers replacing frontier vigilantes. The era that produced men like Hardin doesn't just end, it becomes unrecognizable. By 1900, carrying a gun openly in most Texas towns will get you arrested. The Wild West becomes mythology faster than anyone expected, preserved in stories that bear little resemblance to the blood-soaked reality. Some of Hardin's victims are remembered. Charles Webb, the lawman he killed in Comanche, gets a historical marker. But most vanish into obscurity, their names forgotten, their deaths reduced to statistics in a killer's tally. The black men he murdered during Reconstruction don't even get that. Their deaths are dismissed as the unfortunate byproducts of a turbulent era, as if systematic racial violence was just weather you had to endure. His descendants struggle with the legacy. Some embrace it, trading on the Hardin name for attention and profit. Others change their surnames entirely, desperate to escape the shadow of a great-grandfather who turned killing into a career. Family reunions reportedly avoid mentioning him, as if pretending he didn't exist might somehow erase the bloodline. Modern historians debate what he represents. Some see him as a product of post-Civil War chaos. a young man traumatized by occupation and violence who never learned another way to live. Others see a psychopath who would have been dangerous in any era, who used Reconstruction as an excuse for impulses that existed long before any Yankee soldier arrived. The truth is probably both, and neither explanation makes the bodies any less dead. The question everyone wants answered is whether he actually killed 42 men. Probably not. His own claims shift depending on who's asking and how drunk he is. Verified kills sit around 20, maybe 25. Still an horrific number, but not the legend. He inflated his count the same way he inflated everything else, because in his world, reputation was survival. The bigger the number, the less likely someone would test it. What remains undisputed is the efficiency. He killed his first man at 15, and his last victim died when Hardin was 42. 27 years of consistent violence with only a 15-year interruption for prison. He turned killing into a skill set, something he was genuinely talented at, which might be the most disturbing part. He wasn't some wild-eyed maniac. He was calm, precise, and effective, a professional in the business of death. His grave in Concordia Cemetery still draws visitors, true crime enthusiasts, Old West buffs, people who romanticize an era they don't understand. They take selfies with his headstone, as if standing next to a mass murderer's bones somehow makes them edgy. The cemetery has replaced his marker multiple times because people keep stealing it. John Wesley Hardin wanted to be remembered. He spent his entire life making sure people would never forget his name. In that sense, he succeeded completely. But the legend he carefully constructed in his autobiography has cracked over time, revealing the uglier truth underneath. Not a misunderstood rebel, just a killer who happened to live in an era where killing was briefly profitable. When that era ended, so did he, face down in a saloon, shot from behind by someone who understood the same language of violence. There was never going to be another ending. Men like Hardin don't retire to quiet farms. They die in barrooms or prison cells or at the end of ropes. The only variable was timing. His story isn't a warning because nobody who needs the warning will listen. It's just documentation of what happens when violence becomes identity. John Wesley Hardin proved you can be fast, ruthless, and legendary, and still end up bleeding out on sawdust with strangers stepping over your corpse to order another drink. The West remembered him exactly as he wanted and forgot him exactly as he deserved.